Friction to the pistons. Ladies that twisting, their music's kissing, you forbidden. Rappers that's fake, make no mistake, you we are dissing. To dance on the floor in the round, that is our mission. No sitting, getting fit and shit. Enjoy it, you with them niggas from the dudes.
With a black space low, black cat, sweet styles, big road. Fly, die high, super wise on the flow. See it go out fast, but it come back slow. What you know, what you know?
That it come back slow. It go out fast, but it come back slow.
Nigga, mind how you go.
Keep you swerving control, cause it go out fast, but it come back slow.
All right, welcome to today's webinar, Revolutionary Visions and Practices of Care. If at any point, you can't hear something or you can't see something, please let me know in the chat. I'm super excited for today's event, and I'm going to get started. I have a little bit to go over as moderator, and I want to introduce our very, very exciting guests, Dr. Aziz and Dr. Hwang. And I'm really excited for them to be able to share a little bit about their research and their activism. So the song that many of you have just heard was a little bit of Swerve by Shabazz Palaces from their 2011 album Black Up, just to set the tone a bit for today's conversation. And I wanted to welcome you all to, hopefully I think what will be a really rich and generative conversation. So I wanted to start first with providing a land acknowledgement. The Tutelo Monacan people are the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live. We recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and air that Virginia Tech consumes. We pay respect to the Tutelo Monacan nations and to their elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Bulbir K. Singh, and I am Assistant Professor of Cultural Theory in the Department of Religion and Culture and core faculty in Aspect here at Virginia Tech. I use she, her, hers pronouns. Today's webinar is sponsored by my own department, the Department of Religion and Culture, and is part of Virginia Tech's Women's Month events. Revolutionary Visions and Practices of Care brings together two scholar activists on the politics, ethics, and practice of care in the contemporary. And I'm so delighted to be hosting Dr. Maryam Aziz and Dr. Ren-yo Hwang, who will discuss their respective and intersecting visions for care in the contemporary, spanning abolitionist politics, decarceration, queer and trans of color politics, Black struggle and social movement, self-defense, solidarity, and the collective empowerment of vulnerable communities. Thank you to both of them for their time and energy, and thanks to all who are attending for what I know will be a nourishing and enlivening conversation. Now to introduce these two esteemed speakers to you all. Dr. Maryam Aziz is a postdoctoral fellow in the Richards Center and Africana Research Center, postdoctoral fellow at Penn State University. Dr. Aziz received a PhD in American culture from the University of Michigan in 2020. Dr. Aziz also holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in African American Studies from Columbia University. Dr. Aziz's research asks how folks who practice unarmed self-defense contributed to Black power organizing and shifting ideas about liberation and gender norms. It also traces the learning of martial arts that was facilitated by US militarism during the Cold War. Dr. Aziz's work was showcased in the 2017-18 exhibition Black Power at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, for which Dr. Aziz was a contributing writer and curator for the sections on popular culture and Blaxploitation film. Dr. Aziz currently serves as the current assistant coordinator for American Studies Association's Sports Studies Caucus, as well as the co-director for the Schomburg Mellon Humanities Summer Institute. As a scholar activist, Dr. Aziz regularly teaches radically inclusive self-defense classes in person and now virtually. Further insight into their work can be seen in publications such as Teen Vogue or heard in podcasts such as Burn It All Down. On a personal note, I'm lucky to have met Maryam in Ann Arbor at Michigan, where I was doubly lucky to have taken a self-defense course with them, as well as an incredible bunch of fellow brown women after the 2016 presidential election. It was amazing to see Maryam in action to provide such an important and particular form of self-defense training. And this in addition to being a brilliant scholar. So thank you, Maryam. So Ren-yo Hwang's interdisciplinary teaching and research courses and scholarship include queer and transgender of color critique, feminist of color anti-violence initiatives and genealogies, abolition, transformative justice, and community accountability. Hwang's current scholarship examines carceral technologies of control and punishment, anti-violence reform-based state partnerships of the late 20th century, and discourses concerning the identification of violence. Hwang's first monograph offers a critical interdisciplinary study of anti-violence strategies, namely hate crimes policies, data and community policing against queer and transgender of color survivor-based practices at the margins of mainstream politics in Los Angeles, California over 3 critical decades, the 80s to the 2010s. They have published and forthcoming scholarship in Transgender Studies Quarterly, Abolition Journal, and Critical Ethnic Studies Journal. On a personal note, Ren-yo is such an example to me. I met them at a panel at one of the conferences for the Association for Asian American Studies several years back. And I think it was Miami, which now I realize was 6 years ago. So that's a really long time ago. From Ren-yo's work, I realized the radical potential for abolitionist futures and how such a framework forces us to rethink every system presently at work. Now, for a bit of context for the webinar. So let's start there. In response to Christina Sharp's important 2016 work in The Wake, Saidiya Hartman stated, "Care is the antidote to violence." This continues to ring in my head, and as somebody whose own work is always contending with major and minor forms of violence that animate social life for various vulnerable communities, I started to become increasingly worn down, weathered by the study of violence that did not also consider care as a part of the larger narrative. That is to say that my own thinking and writing and teaching was often starved, only ever concerned with highlighting structural violence, without offering and highlighting the work of people inventively and urgently relating to the violent world through the work of care in its many shapes, forms, and strategies. The events of last week in Atlanta, the targeting of Asian women specifically, have been particularly enraging and makes today's conversation all the more urgent and one defined by mourning. Before addressing some of the animating questions that will contour this conversation, I want to briefly express how and why this event came to be. As a shout out to my current students in my Asian American Experience course, we've been exploring the politics and ethics of care as a central framework for the foundations of Asian American studies and ethnic studies, own radical foundations in study, struggle, and social movement. Broadly speaking and asking, why should we care? Specifically, why should we care about communities beyond our own? How can care itself as a politics and ethics be understood as revolutionary and radical? How can we understand care as the central animating feature of solidarity and solidarity work? And how do we practice care in the everyday? I turn now to both Maryam and Ren-yo, and to begin our conversation. And first of all, thank you again for both being here virtually and sharing your time and insight with us. And we can go in whatever order. I want to keep it loose, keep it informal. I know I just read from paper, which is how I roll, but I do want you guys to feel free to, just be enlivened by one another and interrupt each other. No, no, let's not do that. But yeah, I mean, I think I'll pose some of those bigger animating questions and we can sort of respond however we see fit, sort of move from there. All right. So here's the first bit, and then, so it's just, so the first animating question that we want to sort of broadly just hear about your background, right? So could you each talk a little bit about your backgrounds in both your work as activists and practitioners, as well as scholars? How do you define your approach to both scholarship and practice? Is there a distinction you make between your activist work, praxis, and your scholarship and teaching?
Well, I can kick us off. Thanks so much, Bobby, for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. This is a really juicy question, and it's a little hard to answer, but upon some reflection, I've been thinking about really how the waters of my activism, my practice, and my scholarship have really flowed into one another over the years. I began my journey as a movement practitioner, specifically in Japanese and Okinawan descended martial arts, maybe 17 years ago now. And it really changed my orientation to my body and the bodies of others. I think it's one thing to think about how strong you are. And I think it's a different, very personal, philosophical approach to feel it, both spiritually and physically, regardless of your relationship to able-bodiedness. And I really came into my anti-hate activism that you mentioned earlier through those many years of movement practice. You can either cultivate a very virulent hate of others participating in movement or sporting practices, and you can really embody that hate, as we've seen, or you can resist it, right? And I've chosen to resist it. And in the light of the long histories of hatred that have been leveraged against African Americans, Asian Americans, Muslims, queer folks, et cetera, indigenous folks, it felt really disingenuous to teach and study and research martial arts without an attention to the specificity of how racism can literally sit and weigh on our bodies and strive to take us out of those bodies and largely take those bodies from us. And so my activism really contended with what it meant to write curriculums for wellness and self-defense, and what it meant to be informed by race, gender, and sexuality, among other things. And I thought it was important to understand those lessons from my oral history research, that movement instructors had been saying this for years and just folks had not been paying attention. That they knew that classes should be informed by our identities and not exist outside of them. So my approach to the work was really to stand on the shoulders of others and to acknowledge those shoulders. Some of the arguments that I've made over the past several years are my own, but I find it really okay to say that the ideas that I highlight belong to others of other moments, which is a much more community-centered approach to thinking about writing and scholarship, rather than saying, oh, well, no one has done this before, no one's written this before. So I usually tell folks, I'm like, is it that no one's written it, or that no one with a big name degree has written it or theorized it? And, my definition to my own practice is very similar. It was very ridiculous to me. You mentioned 2016, when I made a bunch of self-defense videos now compiled in the self-defense starter kit. There were news publications that would say, oh, well, you all invented this, right? And it was so weird. I was like, no, you can't invent embodiment, right? I'm like, humans have existed since time before. We might have brought these to a wider audience, but these moves of defending oneself, of being in your body, they've been collectively devised inside folks who've had to navigate harm regularly and thrive. So for me, as someone that teaches comparative racial histories as well as wellness, I think there's a role for a political approach to both types of classrooms. And I think all teaching is activism. Teaching self-defense can make people feel safer. Teaching history can make people feel safer. And my praxis is really focused on the care of making people feel safer. And that springs from a desire to see the most vulnerable of us feel cared for, to feel safe enough to feel joy. And I think that's inherently sort of a queer of color feminist approach to the work. And it's in this lineage of certain types of activism where care and the body and the soul meet that I talk a lot about in my own work.
Thank you so much, Ren-yo. I'm gonna actually stop the share so I can see our faces bigger, but yeah, thank you for that. That's super rich. Yeah, so Ren-yo.
Thanks for kicking us off, Maryam. I just wanted to say first, thank you to Balbir and everyone else at Virginia Tech, the Religion and Women Gender Studies Department, for inviting us to have such a poignant, important conversation as so much, I think, heartbreak and violence is unfolding. I also want to applaud all of us for just showing up. And I mean that for the attendees, the participants, our collaborators in this conversation that are signing on. It's such a heavy time in the world and feels like we're in these constant cycles. So I just want to say, for us to be able to hold space together to discuss what care might look like in these, what feels like really fragile times, I think is really, really moving. And I feel really humbled. I imagine I could be interchanged with tons of other people who could be here to be in this conversation with Maryam. And so I feel really lucky to be doing this. And the question was about kind of our background for people who might have just signed on, and how we got into activism. And, you know, sometimes when I'm asked this question, I go through and I will a little bit about where I came through in terms of who my teachers are or have been, in kind of landing where I am today. I spent 8 years in New York, where I did part of my undergrad. But I would say my education really was coming through queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color, anti-violence kind of movement spaces. So I'll name a few that might ring some bells. They'll have some really formidable names that are attached to it, such as the Audre Lorde Project. I believe, actually, just to shout out Jairus Dixon and Che, who were former leaders and organizers at AOP, are doing the safety talk sometime today, if you Google that, which I think is really great and going to be related to what we discussed today. SRLP, which stands for the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. Fierce, which was and is continuing this really amazing, mostly queer, trans of color led, youth-led organization that took on the hyper-gentrification of the West Village and the Chelsea Piers, and how to kind of create community youth safety. And so those, you know, whether it was mentors or peers, were really my teachers in terms of what I'm doing today still. Then I moved to LA, and also feel like I got my education through organizations on the ground there, spending time working with Dignity Power Now in Los Angeles in the early inception, which used to be the Coalition to End Sheriff Violence in LA Jails, which most notably the founding organizers, Patrisse Cullors, who you might know from Black Lives Matter, but it continues to take on kind of jail expansion in LA, and working with Gender Justice LA as well, and spending some time with different kinds of experimentations of what it looks like to do trans safety and support. And so they're collectives that don't exist anymore, Let's Go Liberation, and others. And I did a lot of organizing with my grad collective when I was a PhD student in ethnic studies at UC Riverside, which I forgot to mention in my bio. That's what I did my doctorate in. And so I name all of these things to say, like, we move through different movement spaces, we find different movement homes, we try on different roles and hats. And I think that's what has made me understand my role in academia as not centrally as an academic only per se. And so I call it a kind of like joyful disloyalty, right? Like that you can move through different kinds of movement spaces and try things on, learn from the people that I think are speaking to your heart. But that's a bit of my background. And prior to all of this, I tried out kind of anti-police punk bike activism, you know, all kinds of things where I was like, are these my people? You know, and I was doing art activism in the streets. I was like, are these my people? Dumpster diving, are these my people? You know, and so I think you'll find that no one has this like trajectory of arrival. I still feel like now I'm out in Western Massachusetts, I'm still trying to figure out how to hold all of those pieces together. So I'll pause there for now. But yeah, great question.
Oh, this is, I mean, super rich. And I mean, for me, I want to sort of respond to some of the things you said. I mean, one, I love this phrase, joyful disloyalty, Ren-yo, because I also do think a lot of the folks who are attending are students, are undergraduates. And I think this is a time for, you know, it can be a moment. And I know we're doing this virtually. There's a pandemic going on. So like that kind of experimentation is hard to have in the same way, but there is a way in which it also opens up kinds of forms of experimentation and being able to just kind of be able to like let yourself be loose with how you approach different kinds of organizing spaces. And I think Maryam's comment too about safety is really, really important to highlight, because this idea about one, like personal safety, right, that comes with this, the connection between body, mind, soul that you're talking about in relation to wellness and self-defense. I think this is something where even just considering, the spaces that we're in, whether it's organizing spaces, whether it's the classroom, like what that does in terms of making people feel less alienated, right? That's part of care, right? It's about the relationality that we have, the sort of ways that we can interact with each other and relate and create forms of connection and affiliation that are outside of unsafe spaces, right? Outside of things that maybe aren't um, necessarily providing the care that they should, right? Like the family space, right? Or the home, right? So thinking about, I think because the discourse around safety is so oftentimes really fraught in terms of one thinking about, everyday individual sort of senses of personal safety, but then we also have the sort of like other hand of, like, as Mariam was talking about, that response to 2016 where it became the sort of like more heavy-handed response of like the safety and security discourses that we've had for since the start of the century, right? But I mean, I think it's just a really sort of, it's a really important question, because I don't think we sort of recognize how unsafe we oftentimes really feel in the world, right? And that these different kinds of modes of engagement, whether it's again in the classroom or in these different kinds of meetings, and spaces in the streets, right? What that does. So that's sort of really rich. Um, yeah. So I mean, I'm gonna I mean, I'll pose another question, but feel free to, like, respond as you see fit. But the sort of next bigger question I have is that, like, recognizing the kind of work that you do on a scholarly level, right? Um, so both of you work on subjects that reckon with the violence that we live with, right? So just really recognizing how we live in a world that is so full of violence, and we keep again seeing this, especially in the last just couple of weeks, how heavy it feels, right? So Mariam's work on unarmed self-defense acknowledges the racial antagonisms that define our world, and Ren-yo's work on incarceration as a violent project of exploitation and slow death. So how are such forms of study important to the various struggles and movements they are informed by, such as the Black Power movement and the prison abolitionist movement? So that's another sort of posing of that sort of set of questions.
Yeah, and I mean, I really appreciate the framing and the tenderness that we're moving with, given the things that have happened in the last week and a half. And so I'm attentive in my response to know that a lot of us on this call have been holding a lot of that violence really close. And so I'll tread lightly with my response. But, I think that when you study different types of social movements, you understand that dialectical relationship between us and the violence, right? I mean, it's, I guess maybe Judeo-Christianity and its like ideas around violence us think that, right, it's an original part of man, right? That it's almost always prevalent. But I do want to encourage people, like in a US context, like as a Black Power historian, I actively think about how violence is invited upon and projected upon certain of us. And it's not natural, right? And I think very much about organizers like folks in the Nation of Islam, for example, who really prove that Blackness is the problem, right? Or the color of your skin is the problem. For a long time, right, the idea of the Black Power movement was this was a violent Black freedom movement that destroyed the civil rights movement, right? And any movement that follows in line with the Black Power movement or is in solidarity with the Black Power movement, like Yellow Power, for example, also has these hints of violence, right? But you have organizers who are minding their business, and the US is going, like the US government, let's say very specifically, is going out of its way to try and track violence onto them, right? To say, we're actually surveilling you to keep us safe. But like this idea of who does safety belong to and who does it not belong to, I think about a lot. So for example, one of my favorite documents to talk about, but that I hate exists, there was this mid-1960s brief that the San Diego police put out, and it was about the Nation of Islam in the San Diego to LA area. And they were basically like, listen, they're dangerous, right? They're actually plotting to overthrow the US government, and local police departments should be aware and should be on hyper alert for members of this organization. Now, mind you, what they used in the brief to make this argument was to say, well, you know, they remind us of like the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, right? A revolutionary movement in Kenya, and they're practicing judo, right? So judo is a Japanese descended martial art. Nowhere in the brief did it say, you know, they're carrying guns or they're carrying arms, or they're actually, like, they literally said, we cannot prove that they're plotting revolution, but given who they read, given who they're in solidarity with, and given this very dangerous unarmed art, we know that they're capable of it. And so for me as a scholar of unarmed self-defense, and even thinking about this moment of, or just these long moments of abolition, right? What does it mean when we just focus on saying that, well, folks invite this because of who they are and their identities, right? Or because they look dangerous, because they're in a certain economy, because they're carrying something. And I'm like, no, you can be existing and trying to do community safety and show up on a FBI watch list, right? And so that's one of the things that I really reckon with and sit with. You know, they could not pin on them armed revolution, but still somehow the Nation of Islam kicks off, what, 70 years of African Americans and Muslims being surveilled, right? Often we think that Islamophobic surveillance happens around 9/11, but we know, I mean, the US's intervention in the Middle East and other parts of Asia over the 20th century, but also just anti-Blackness and Islamophobia being so old. So those are things that I think about with that relationship to violence and these various struggles. And yeah, I mean, I think another thing I'll say that intersects is that when people remember these movements as only thinking about armed self-defense, which is very valid, right? I mean, I think the Panthers, we all know, do a great job of saying these are our amendment rights. And also there's terror. There is literal white terror if we don't protect ourselves. But even for them, you know, for the long history of the Black Panther Party, their focus actually is not on their ability to bear arms, but is on this idea of community protection and quote unquote survival pending revolution. So if you think about it, they probably teach more African Americans unarmed self-defense over the course of the 15 years that we might think of them than they do armed self-defense. But what does that mean when that one picture is used to demonize them and their forms of care work, right? We invisibilize that they kicked off the free breakfast programs that the federal government and schools have now implemented. We erase the free clinics, we erase their free shoe program, we erase their free wellness programs, right? And so there's this interesting relationship that's going on. So I think that's what I'll say for now.
That's such a important grounding, Maryam, that helps to, I think, expand our discussion of what even gets understood or counted as violence versus self-defense. And so I'm going to look at the question again. But when we think about and understand violence in a US criminal justice system, right? So much of it is within the letter of the law. And so what we understand as being even technically considered the threshold of self-defense is hyper problematic, right? And I'm thinking of the work of Survived and Punished, which is an incredible national organization that supports mostly, you'll see women and queer people of color who have defended themselves during different kinds of harm, violence, aggression, and instead been penalized, right, and sentenced for what they considered to be the premier, act of aggression, right? So whether the person who they're defending themselves against was kind of a chronic abuser in their life, or someone who was just kind of stranger street violence in the case of someone like Cece McDonald, which you can follow, a Black trans woman who spent, I think, over 18 months in a men's facility for defending herself against a white supremacist. And that's not conjecture. He had, I think, a swastika tattoo and whatnot. And so these are not uncommon stories. I will just say Survived and Punished came out of a survivor defense committee that was standing up for Marissa Alexander, a Black woman and mother in Florida, after the death of Trayvon Martin, Black youth, by George Zimmerman, which now feels like almost a decade ago, which is unbelievable to think about. But that George Zimmerman was able to use the stand your ground defense, and Marissa Alexander, who shot a warning shot into the ceiling for her chronic abuser, and was looking to potentially spend a lifetime in prison. And so that's where Survived and Punished, that's some of the story. Elisa Vieira, if you look up her work, is so brilliant. Colby Lenz, they are some of the co-founders of Survived and Punished. But I mentioned that to just say what we register and understand as violence has been very much structured ideologically, culturally, and otherwise by what the criminal justice system deems as being violent. So you have binaries such as violent, non-violent offenses, right? And what counts as those often falls on anti-Black kind of racialized logic, right? But I say this all too in terms of the mutual aid long-term work I've been doing with trans women incarcerated in California prisons, specifically in Corcoran. I've been doing that for a number of years, and any act of self-defense is not self-defense, right? It is seen as threat, security threat, even when intimate queer bonds are being made between people inside, that's considered potential security threat groups, right? They're maybe gang affiliated, right? And so there's all these ways in which our ledger of what is violence, and we began with the Sadia Hartman quote in reference to Christina Sharp, but people, mostly Black feminists who've been really grounding and having us understand how violence, the scales of violence, right, and how they intersect with gender, sexuality, and race, right? These are not, they're inextricable, right? And so one thing to look up, and I think the PDF, you can find it online, is The Violence Matrix by Bethy Ritchie, who's like a model for what I understand as an organizer and a scholar. This is from her Arrested Justice book, I believe from 2014, but she's really showing how the ways in which interpersonal domestic violence intersect with structural violence, right, and state baseline and historical conditions of violence. And so, yeah, that I think is an important way to kind of rethink even what we mean when we say violence, right? So I'll read this one quote really quickly. It's from some of my favorite, I can consider them the committee of my life. In If They Come in the Morning, Voices of Resistance, this publication that came out in 1971, that Angela Davis co-authored with contributors from Black Panther Party, the Soledad Brothers. Bettina Apikar was the co-editor for that. But James Baldwin's writing a letter to Angela Yvonne Davis while she is a political prisoner. And I began one of my abolitionist syllabi with this question, right? And it says, he writes, "If we know, then we must fight for your life as though it were our own," which it is, "and render impassable from our bodies the corridor to the gas chamber. For if they come for you, if they take you in the morning, they will be coming for us at night. Therefore, peace." And I think about this a lot in terms of what have been armed resistance struggles, right? That have been deemed as terrorist groups, right? As different, I think a lot of people might have watched recently Judas and the Black Messiah, right? These different ways in which we were even popularizing, thinking about what armed resistance or nonviolent, violent self-defense means. And I think that will open up us to more conversation. But I say that in terms of thinking about different kind of scales of aggression that Black and Indigenous people in Turtle Island have been experiencing for centuries, right?
Yeah.
Can I jump
Thank
back
you.
in? I mean,
Yeah.
oh, go ahead.
No, please.
No, I mean, I love what you're saying, about like these longer histories of self-defense, and particularly trans women and in the Black community. I mean, all women who have literally, if we look at Hartman, and we think about the work that she does in her book, Scenes of Subjection, and we think about Celia the Slave, and the ways in which, right, like she's literally defending herself against, the white man that purports to own her, right? And the idea that for the majority of the existence of this country, right, you have no legal claim to self-defense, like you said. And I mean, even if we jump to the 20th century, I mean, if we go to Joanne Little in the 1970s, this galvanizing case that comes out, or is around the same time that Angela Davis really starts writing about prison abolition that we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of, the amount of women of color, and particularly Black women that were incarcerated for defending themselves, whether they were armed or unarmed, right? It actually didn't make a difference, right? If you accidentally killed someone, if you maimed them, if you permanently hurt them, right? Who actually got to claim self-defense? Who got to claim violence? And one of the other cases that I think about in conjunction with CeCe McDonald, for example, is, I think they're often colloquially called New Jersey 4, but 4 African-American lesbian women around the early 2000s are out in New York City and are being harassed and followed. And they defend themselves, right? And there's a knife that comes out, right, in the process of this happening. I won't go into details because I want to be mindful. But what actually happens is that the people who are defending themselves, actually, there's no proof that they even actually use the weapon itself, right? But then they all get different varying sentences, right? And so it's this idea that in the world of stand your ground in Florida, which bothers me to no end, right? Where you can have someone like George Zimmerman, whose defense didn't even legally invoke stand your ground, almost work theoretically in his favor and not work for Marissa Alexander. And then you can also have these folks who it's like, it can be literally, it could be a cooking knife, right? That's literally what it could be. But the idea that you do not have access to something that is theoretically given as a right broadly, right? That actually folks who stormed the Capitol probably think is a right that they're defending, but we don't have equal access to it. And I also want to uplift the work of mutual aid organizations like Thorn Self-Defense right now, who are doing really great work in distributing self-defense kits to Black trans women in different cities. I can't remember, there's one in Chicago, there's also one in LA, and they're really great work to uplift and support in these times.
No, I mean, I think this sort of moment that I think, Ren-yo, you mentioned, right? I think it's any act of self-defense is not self-defense, right? And thinking about also the use of this term scale, right? So the asymmetries of violence that we're talking about in regards to thinking about violence, force, and also these forms of like intimate harm, right? That we're sort of exploring through both of your work. I think it's really important to think too about how it's these asymmetries of violence that end up really like ultimately defining how we understand, right? What self-defense looks like in an inherently and overwhelmingly violent world, right? One that is defined by, again, very many different kinds of forms of harm, right? From patriarchal violence to gender-based violence to racist violence, right? And so this is why too, even the discourse around like for Ren-yo's work, I mean, both of you, right? Thinking too about like what hate and hate crime legislation looks like, right? How that's also really tense and fraught in terms of the way it came about, right? Its origins and how that too kind of muddles the conversation around how we understand these forms of violence and harm. So I'm going to pose another sort of animating question, but obviously we can sort of feel free to sort of jump around a bit, right? So really broadly speaking, right, in terms of really thinking about how we're moving from addressing that violence, right, and then talking about care itself, right, as an ethic, as a politic. So how do you center care in your work? How might you define an ethic of care? And who are some folks who have inspired how you think about care as an ethical relation or political orientation? And I know, we started off with the Saidiya Hartman quote, but I think it's the way that we're all sort of indebted to Black feminists and Black feminist thinkers, and the work of Black women and queer organizers is really sort of so clear, right? So I'd love to hear a little bit about how care itself is sort of one way of thinking about your work too broadly.
Maryam, you want me to, okay, yeah. Also, I invite being interrupted at any time. Please jump in. I love the feeling of a conversation. Yeah, I do think Maryam mentioned earlier mutual aid and different projects of thinking about care. I was just talking to a friend recently about the different ways in which there has been such exciting kinds of, I think, collective exchanges and dialogue about what care means and what it means to show up, both in the aftermath of, I think, really heavy trauma, collective trauma being experienced, and kind of in preparation for which is and has been a cycle of trauma. And just kind of to connect to the last question, really thinking about who has been defining care or violence or these really large terms for us, right? And so people now turn to and call the self-care industrial complex, right? This kind of, and I love this term, it's helpful, toxic positivity, right? That's kind of pushed as a mode of what it means to get through this pandemic at this moment, right? And we all kind of fall into the kind of internalized, oppressive, I would say, expectations that we need to feel good and do the most to always be good, and if say you're someone who's a teacher, right, or someone who holds space for others, you need to be like kind of at this level of like being as grounded as possible. And the truth is, like, I don't think anyone is doing great right now under the pandemic. And I think that's the heaviness that we need to be able to hold. I was listening to Prentice Hemphill, who was invited to our college to do this conversation with Dean Spade. Gina B. Kim was this queer of color disability scholar, was hosting this conversation. And Prentice said this thing that was really so helpful, which is we need to normalize the ups and the downs, right? We need to normalize this kind of, not this feeling of kind of arriving at just being stable, right? And I think that's something I've noticed in all my conversations, which are like the best we can do in terms of caring for our friends who are in crisis right now, is trying to reflect to them that like it's very, it should be expected, right? That we have kind of these intense feelings that are not easy to fully grasp on our own. But I say that because I think so much of care, and I write about this in other work, has been really kind of individuated as a thing you do for someone else, right? Or a thing that you can receive if you can access this, a thing if you attend this webinar, right? That you can learn what radical care is, right? Like, no, right? Like, I think the idea is that we're in conversation to demystify, right? And to try to attend to what care might look like for you, which is radically different than someone else. And I say this all because we are also under kind of a very oppressive medical industrial complex that also denotes what care should look like, right? And so healing justice, disability justice, I think, are spaces in which they've been pushing back and talking back to these models of being in service to doing a certain kind of care work for someone else. And so I think about care as kind of a constant call and response that always has to be done collectively, right? And collective, that might be a really tight-knit circle, right? And I'll just mention, like, looking at Mia Mingus, if I believe you read that in class as well, but the work she's doing in Turkey, talking about what it means to create a pod, and thinking about what kind of people you trust to show up for you, right? That's kind of the kind of self-determination of care that I'm interested in, invested in supporting folks and myself, right, to be in practice of. But I'll pause there and pass it over.
I mean, fabulous. I mean, I'm basically going to say very similar things. Yeah, I don't think that I don't think all of us can specialize in every form of care. And I think that care can and should manifest differently. And so for me, defining an ethic of care requires specificity, but it also just requires a general appreciation for life and for living. And that care is rooted in liberation. And I 1000% agree. It's not about these individual acts. It's about this ethic of care that's dedicated to collective notions of well-being. So if you're dedicated to care, right, I'm like, you're dedicated to making sure certain groups of people have don't have this, let's say, this premature exposure to death, loosely quoting Ruth Gilmore, right? That like literally there are those of us who belong to race, gender, sexualities that are not being tracked into violence or premature death by the state. If you're committed to a collective notion of care, you really do think about defunding the police. And I think this is really hard for a lot of folks to think about, but that's a form of care, right? Redistributing money back to communities to care for themselves holistically, that's care. And care doesn't just look like giving police departments millions of dollars to reform themselves, right? Or to penalize sex workers or migrant workers, right? Or to, pay police to investigate more anti-Asian hate incidents. It really doesn't. Because what are they going to do? They're going to deny that racism and sexism and these histories of imperialism are involved. And that's not care at all. And so what would it mean to actually have a collective notion of care that helps Black and Asian refugees in the United States, right? That's not individual care. That's not saying, well, we have appropriated forms of yoga and movement practices, and we're just going to give it back to you, right? Like, so yeah, I think in my own work, I study, I center care through studying these histories of wellness. But I think what's important for me is to also treat the folks that like I study and who I listen to with care also. I think particularly as a historian, I think feminist scholars of activism have really been quick to remind us that social movements, they don't exist in a direct action vacuum, right? That people have taken the time to care for themselves and stay present. And again, I think I quoted it earlier, to survive pending revolution. So I want to know, like, what are we doing in our evenings? Why were folks in studios, like sweating in their bodies, inclusive of abilities to sort of make it through, right? Why were they going to festivals after demonstrations? Why were they laughing in community? Why are people spontaneously participating in music, right, in the middle of a movement for Black Lives Matter protest? And I would just say that the folks who've influenced me, right, are these sort of organizers and theorists from the mid 20th century that really emphasize the mind, body, and spirit connection, particularly feminist scholars, and really the independent educators of the 60s and 70s who said, the public school system in the US is its own form of violence. And we want to teach our own children self-control, self-love, and self-appreciation. So for me, I love the idea of survival of pending revolution, and that as self-love. And for me, that's almost where like the ethic of care of like the Black Panther Party and the Congress of African People meet sort of Audre Lorde, our wonderful theorist, Audre Lorde's personal as political. So yeah.
I just need to say, like, my mind is like, just like boom, boom, boom. Like, everything you guys like, I mean, obviously have been saying this entire time is like, there's so many sort of like just multiple directions that I want to take us. I'm just like, well, one thing Maryam said early in this response was this really, like, to me, it's this basic idea, but this idea of appreciation for life and living is something that, like, we see in the kind of world that we're in, that this is something that is lacking for so many people, right? And I don't want to highlight or spend time with that, but to really think about what it means to actually acknowledge that we are interdependent, right? And so Ren-yo, you also mentioned, like, for my students in my Asian American experience class, we did read Mia Mingus on access, intimacy, and interdependence, and specifically just thinking about just ourselves and our bodies as interdependently we are constantly relating to each other in this way that is ultimately about understanding that we are in a world that doesn't really place value on appreciating life and the living while we're here, right? Oftentimes it's this care after death. And I think this is where, oftentimes we get it all wrong, right? Where I think both of you practice and, do your research, your writing, and your organizing in ways that really do center like being present, right? And I think that's something, like in terms of like Ruth Gilmore's own sort of framework of abolition is about presence, right? And about care as an active, and an active presence is really, really important. I also should note too, because I keep forgetting to type this in, please place questions in the Q&A as we will sort of move to Q&A portion so that we can open it up for folks. But yeah, I really want to say, like, I feel like we could do a bunch of different webinars, but I don't know where that would get us in terms of just how rich you guys is really like what you're speaking to, right? Because there's so much there. So just moving into like thinking about the communities that you each engage, I'd love to just have you guys reflect on how you do that in your research and teaching, right? A lot of folks here are either students or grad students or faculty, right? But thinking about how it inflects your own sort of methods of approaching things in the classroom or in your own writing, where it inflects that, right? So how do you honor such knowledge and experiences in your work? Because that's something that for me, I wrestle with, like, how do you do those communities justice, right? Your own communities oftentimes, right? And what that means in terms of really sort of centering and engaging them.
Do you want to start, Maryam? Okay. I was going to jump in and actually connects to what you just asked us, Balbir, but I was going to remind folks, like, I think it's also so powerful to see other people model what care looks like, how they hold boundaries, right? How they apologize, right? To kind of turn to some of the work Nia Mingus does, like that we've really never learned ever through K through 12 schooling, even in college and even in grad school, wherever your kind of higher formal education takes you, like what it means to apologize and be accountable for when you make mistakes, when you do harm. And I mention that as someone who has been part of the transformative justice movement for decades now, where we grapple with what it looks like to show up for survivors and folks who've been harmed. And at the same time, no one is above harming someone else, right? And so what does it look like to actually be accountable? I see that as part of community care. And we really are kind of just learning the tools together as what this looks like and what this can mean. I feel like I'm learning that every day, right? What I do, how it impacts students, young people around me, right? As we move into different roles, as we grow older, right? You're like, oh, right, there's an expectation that now I'm being called an elder in some of the spaces I'm in, right? That I'm still learning alongside, right? Young folks who are challenging me all the time in what I understood as like the frameworks I was raised on in kind of QT BIPOC organizing spaces, radical organizing spaces. So I'll just mention someone who I wanted to lift up their work is Elliot Fukui. Elliot, he is was an organizer with Audre Lorde Project for some time and now does all kinds of, like, I think, public intellectual work, but as a MAD identified queer, trans, Asian survivor. And you can actually find his, I'll drop it in the chat at madqueer.org. But he does, some of the work he does is around what he calls cathartic cartographies. And I'll just read what he wrote about that because I think it's powerful, right? cathartic cartographies are a spatial, justice-based approach to examining our personal identities in relationship to the spaces we inhabit, the traumas we experience, and how our feelings show up in the landscapes we navigate every day. And I say that because I think that's an important part of the conversation around care, right? Is to kind of unpack that even what we understand as being the work of care constantly changes based on a variety of needs that we have that are kind of ever changing as well. Now I'm forgetting what the original question was, but just to say, I constantly am trying to be as present and listen as much in terms of even my own learning, right? Like we don't arrive at a place where if you read these things, you got it, you finish this class. And so to be able to have, I think that approach has allowed me to, I think, radicalize my understanding of care, right? So yeah, I'll pass it over to you, Maureen.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief because I know we want to get to folks' questions. But I think going to, I guess, or I'm sitting with the ideas of reflecting and honoring communities in research and teaching. And I guess one of the first things I'll say is that I feel like there's a lot of justified rage about maybe the last 2 weeks being the first moment where a lot of pedagogues sat and said, oh, we have Asian American students from across multiple diasporas and class backgrounds and genders. We should really start trying to care for them in our classes. And for me, you know, it was like, it's justifiable rage because if you're reactive, almost, which is almost a university, like a universal university standpoint, like we react to things. If you're not proactive in centering the diverse identities of folks in your classroom, right? If you weren't already having conversations in history classes on the 20th century about why a Pan-Asian identity came into being, but also how it can be unhelpful and used against folks, like if that wasn't already embedded in and there wasn't space for to tease that out, or, you know, if the last 2 weeks was the first time that you said that the model minority was a myth, right? That that's a way that you're not reflecting and honoring folks in classrooms. But I think that's the university side. My self-defense hat on for a second. I really, well, it might be both still, but I just ask, you know, who's the expert of their experience, which I think is, you know, a Black feminist approach to history. And so I think they're often, for self-defense instructors, there's this thing where it's like, well, I have all the knowledge because I have these years in self-defense, or I have this belt in this martial art, right? So I understand what you're going through, or let me figure out what you're going through. And I very quickly created the public stance that I was like, I'm not presupposing the types of violences that anyone faces walking into my classroom, which is why research became so important for me, right? I mean, I love the fact that the anti-Asian hate incident brief came out, not because I want there to be a brief, but I want people to actually understand the multifaceted ways in which hate is showing up. And something you said earlier, Bobby, about like how people like are sometimes aren't feeling with how unsafe they actually feel. I think that those reports are really important, right? There was actually, so 4 years ago when you took my class, I had gone through a database of all of the Islamophobic related hate crimes that people across all races were facing pre the 2016 election. So when the cycle started in 2015 and for like 5 months, so a database at muslimgirl.com tracked like 300, 400, hundreds of hate incidences. And I don't, you know, recommend this. This wasn't a happy afternoon, but like I went through and was able to say, okay, these are actually the things that folks are facing, right? And I was like, just because I might share an identity with some of you, I'm not going to presuppose what's there. And that helped me make a very specific curriculum to honor and hold space for various communities in my classroom. And it could literally say, you know, because there are folks, again, who will literally say you're lying, right, to your face and say you're not actually unsafe. I remember distinctly when we did the scarf grab self-defense videos, there were several circulating, and there were, you know, I'm going to say what I saw, right? White cishet men on the internet who are like, but that's not a thing, right? Like there aren't people in the New York subway who are actually having scarves grabbed. And it's like, so they're telling folks who are walking around in their bodies at the intersections of multiple Islamophobic hate, that it's not real, right? But there I was in Staten Island teaching a 9-year-old African-American girl who had had her scarf grabbed on the playground, right? And so for me, it was like, well, what do you need, right? As a young girl who's literally trying to enjoy joy, to feel safe, or what do you need just to feel better in your body? So, I mean, those are the things that I think about when I'm trying to honor folks, right? So, tell me about your experiences. Like, if you're a child of refugees that visibly stands out in the city where you were allowed to settle, right? Where the US carved out space for you to settle, what makes you feel like you don't belong there? What do other people project onto you? What types of safety and feeling are you craving for your body and your spirit, right? And I think about this for lots of different intersections. Yeah, so I mean, I think I'll say that. And I don't want to forget to mention, you have to really understand when you're honoring these experiences is who's being silenced, right? Who's being erased and who's being told they're not in the in the equation at all, right? So I mean, literally, I would say that like broke folks are, let's say, for example, like silencing and ignoring the experiences of brown Southeast Asian folks, right, who are suffering under hate at the intersection of colorism as well, right? Or there are folks that have completely left out of narratives of safety, like transmasculine folks, right? Because of the ways in which they sit at their identities, there isn't a lot of space that folks can articulately and hold with care the violences and the harms that they face, right? So I'm like, whether I share someone's identity or not, I'm like, tell me about your folks, tell me about your people, tell me who you are, and let's figure out how to honor that together, right? And I mean, we've been talking about a lot of CRIP studies and really important disability studies. And I think that extends across all of the different intersections, right? I mean, folks will look at someone that's brown, trans, and disabled and queer and say, you can't participate in a movement space, right? And that's the furthest from the case, right? And so I've had plenty of classrooms where we can have folks who are living at the intersections of all of their identities find the ways to show up in their power and mold their own ideas about themselves. So I think that I'll end there.
And Maryam, I'll just add to that because I think that's so powerful in when we think about what the university and academic spaces do, right? Which is often create this false idea of a chasm between community, right? And we see this in service learning, community-based learning spaces, in different kinds of ways in which you're supposed to learn to volunteerism, if you will, right? That ranges from philanthropy, to kind of like, I would say, show up in the closest hood next to your campus and you're going to do some service work, right? And learn that this is what it means to, I think mutual aid, the conversation there is really pushing that, right? And I just wanted to add like how to do that in a classroom space when in reality, you have often students who come from communities that have been criminalized, surveilled, impoverished, and dealing with this kind of guilt, right? I find that a lot with my students of color, specifically Black and Latinx and Indigenous students, where they feel like they've become a traitor, right, in some ways. And I would say East and South Asian students who come from different kinds of surveillance, class, immigration backgrounds too, right? Where there's this feeling of like, I've traded up and am I a traitor to my community? And what can I do to continue? And we're kind of supposed to be teaching them to have this relationship to their community that's like, the talented 10th, if you will, and vanguardism, right? Of like, now your job is to go back. And a lot of my work in my action research classes has been to dispel that idea that because you're in this institutional space, somehow you've severed these ties that were a part of your life and your upbringing, right? And rather, what are these different ways in which we're already kind of doing this kind of relational exchange? And then I think for different kinds of privileged, self-identified, privileged or white students trying to relate to what it means to be doing work alongside, Black, Indigenous, POC, right? And I think challenging the kind of allyship industrial complex, right? There has and continues to be this really important, I think, rich discussion about not just positionality and identity politics, but really what it means to root yourself in a relationship that goes beyond the classroom, right? And I think that's some of the hardest stuff to do in this kind of crisis moment of like, what does it even mean to graduate with a BA, right? And what does it mean to be of and in the world, right? And so kind of going in a circle, but just to say, I'm constantly challenged by that too. And so some of that means things like you were just mentioning, Maryam, there are this uptick of kind of like databases that are supposed to, such as the Stop API, AAPI hate database, where you're supposed to kind of self-log, if you will, hate incidences. And in some ways, some of them are unofficial, some of them are collaborative with police departments. But the question is this feeling of like, I need this to be seen and understood as something that happened to me. And I try to demystify for students what that looks like to participate in that way versus I think other examples such as the Young Women's Empowerment Project, right, that Shir Hassan, it's a former organization that doesn't exist anymore, but where it was mostly femmes and young girls who were in the sex trade industry, right? But they developed their own research that was about what they needed, right? And it wasn't about what they thought they needed to ask for from law enforcement. And that's a really different pivot because there are models and examples of what that looks like to think and self-define community safety, right? That goes beyond legal recognition, right? Which is a lot of what hate crimes legislation is able to provide at most, right? Which I know is hard work that's difficult, right? Because it's not as if that doesn't matter in the abolitionist framework. It's saying what else is important, right? Beyond just legal recognition and penalization at the end of the day. I just wanted to add to that conversation with Maryam there, but yeah, I'll pause.
Thank you both. I mean, this is super rich in terms of, I mean, I think one, the sort of way you guys both highlight like self-reflexivity in terms of how you're like sort of responding to people's individual sort of needs and concerns, right? And then also thinking about the ways that we're all, like Ren-yo, you started off by saying we're all capable of harm, right? And I'm paraphrasing, but that captures so well like what it means to sort of have these relationships, you know, and understand the world as necessarily relational and interdependent, and also to highlight too the way that we're not above apology, right? So thinking to with our students in the classroom, like what it means to be held accountable in those spaces, to be asked to do better always, right? And as you mentioned too, right, being looked at as an elder, right, in terms of organizing spaces or activist spaces is also super sort of helpful in terms of what that means. So I want to pivot a little bit into some of the Q&A, just because we're running low on time, and I know we could go in so many directions, and I'm super excited by that. But I want to address some of the folks that asked some questions. So, so Sarah had asked early on, right? Hi, I was just wondering how you all each personally define and practice self-care. So maybe a more sort of personal question if you guys want to share that. And I'll take, maybe we can do like 2 questions at a time so you can respond to both at the same time or either or. And then Shah asked, thank you both Dr. Aziz and Dr. Hwang for your thoughtful reflections on care and community. Early in the discussion, Dr. Aziz mentioned that their work in self-defense has shaped how they write. I was wondering if you both can say more about care and embodiment, how it's shaped your fieldwork, research, and writing process. And then we'll move on to the other 2 questions, and as more come in, we'll do that too. I'm going to also just share the screen now because you guys provided some great resources. So I wanted to post those up too so everyone could see that. And this was obviously being recorded, so I'm happy to share the recording once it's available.
So that first question was about our personal definitions of self-care.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll just respond to that very quickly. I mean, I don't have a very rigorous personal definition of self-care, but my definition is always boundaried. My self-care is about maintaining my boundaries in my personal life and winning to take all of those hats that I've been talking about off, and how not to violate those boundaries. And particularly, I think at my stage in the academy, there's a lot of impulse to go, 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 go. And I have to hit this. I need to finish this to get this type of position, to have this much job security, right, under capitalism. And for me, self-care is to be boundaried and to say that it doesn't matter what's happening, right? Actually, my Saturday is always this. I'm never going to work on a Saturday from now until my last breath. If you catch me working on a Saturday, then you can call me in, because that is against my ethic of personal self-care. I'm going to leave a little bit more time to respond to the second question.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of you all, and I was reading the chat, have been kind of expressing your own ideas. I think someone who earlier was talking about you can't take care of someone else before you take care of yourself. I think RuPaul said some version of that too. But I definitely think, you know, my self-care is really bound up in how I show up for other people. And that, if anything, that's actually been a way of me mitigating what I need first. And that's something that's been kind of a life lesson. And so self-care for me is being able to feel connected in my body, which I think sometimes is really hard in this moment of a pandemic and everything else, where we're not maybe doing the same routines that sometimes bring us life and make us feel fulfilled. And so if this is just kind of a question of like things I do to like breathing, I know that sounds so silly, but I mean, definitely not to Maryam and the work you do, but like just figuring out different breathing practices that I had to do that before getting on this call. Public speaking is not like my favorite thing ever. But you know, that's something that's like super helpful, is to just know, like, pay attention to your body, right? And what it needs, right? I notice when I'm having shallow breath that maybe doing a couple of counts of inhales and exhales, right? Two things that I think are more routine, right? Moving your body, whatever that might look like for you in your personal abilities and kind of health needs, right? Whatever that might mean. But I think kind of that awareness of what's going on for me has been the ongoing and important challenge in terms of me understanding what self-care looks like. And so that's constantly, I think, the question that I try to ground myself with is like, what do I need, right? And so, yeah. And the other question, Dr. Aziz, I believe this was more for you, but embodiment, shape, fieldwork, research, right? And similarly, I would say teaching is what it looks like for me to be able to show up. I get a lot of prison calls all the time, and I recently made a boundary, because I'm on the East Coast now and it's mostly folks in Cali, to not pick up calls after 9 or 10. And so I know that sounds silly, but it's just like one thing that I was like, I can't, in my embodiment, I know I'm not going to be well if I'm trying to field calls past a certain time, right? So things like that remind me that, like, that's how I can show up better. And as far as writing, and research and field work, yeah, I think sometimes it's knowing that I've been making appointments with myself to write, right? Because sometimes that can be the thing, I'm sure students feel the same way too, that happens last, right? You're doing a lot of reading, research, and all these other things, but not actually doing the writing. And so that's something I'm on research sabbatical now, that I've really had to say, if writing is important, I need to actually make it a priority. And so that's something that I try to hold in all of its contradictions of trying to be generative in a pandemic. Maryam, do you want to jump back in?
Yeah, and thanks again to Sarah for the first question. Shanor, in terms of your question, I'll try and answer it quickly. In terms of my writing, I think I write like I move. It's really important as someone who literally studies movement to do that, right? So I I literally will write a sentence that says punches punctuating the air, right? Because that's literally what my fist is doing when it's doing something like that. So I write like I move, also because I write like I'm actively listening. Like I imagine that there are some, you know, literal queer babies like in a daycare somewhere who are going to listen to a bedtime story about, you know, women warriors, queer warriors doing martial arts practice, right? And I want them to be active listeners and to enjoy what they're hearing, right? Um, yeah, and I would say that yeah, I don't, the other thing about my writing practice that's similar to my movement is I don't cut myself off in the middle of a movement. Like if, you know, I'm doing, you know, a fling of my wrists or, you know, a palm heel strike or a stretch. I don't like to cut myself off in the middle of that movement. So I don't like to cut myself off in the body of my paragraphs also. So I like to just write. I don't like to edit as I go. And I like to go back and maybe refine on the next stage. I know a lot of people get bogged down and let me edit every paragraph as I go. And that's not how I have finished any of my writing up until this point. So I treat my body paragraphs like my actual body. And then care, then influencing like field work, I would say, because I do oral histories, you know, if I use the pandemic as an example, you know, I checked in with some of the folks I interviewed to say, hey, do you need anything? Do you need me to send you something, right? These are folks who are, you know, literally people would consider now movement elders, right? And as someone who's very attuned to Black elders and the relationship that they have to health and life, you know, I want to make sure that I'm like checking in on them. If I can send something, you know, I don't anticipate making lots of money off of a future book, but I am also attentive to the odd, bizarre way that, you know, the folks whose lives we often talk about, right, don't see that money. So I'm think about care in like my folks that I talk to as redistributing any little bit of money that I accrue. Yeah, and I also, as a scholar, I don't assume that people are not telling the truth. I think that's as a historian, sometimes people read something and they automatically assume that they have to like be like, this might be true, right? But like I actually like to come from a position of care that says actually they're telling the truth about their own existence. So I'll stop there so we can do some other questions for the end.
Thank you for that, Maryam. That's such a like exemplary way of doing like the writing. Honestly, you know, it's like so easy to like hold that tension in, right? And you know, a lot of us have like perfectionist tendencies. So also just like letting yourself write and then refine as you go, I think is just helpful. You know, I try to like think of that tension as like, you know, reading Funno and being like, oh yes, this is the tension of like all sorts of militant ideas coming out. And then I'm like, no, this is not that. It's honestly just unnecessary perfectionist tendencies that a lot of people have. So I appreciate the like sort of movement-based methods. So we have a few more questions and hopefully we can sort of, I'm going to pose two, again, answer as you see fit. Fatima's question asks, thank you. So I'm kind of jumping around because I think this is kind of an interesting question right now. Thank you for the great meeting. You mentioned young adults of color, this is Ren-yo specific, right? Feeling like they are traitors to their race. And obviously both of you should feel free to answer it. I feel this deeply and quite often. Would you be willing to elaborate on this and how young POC can bridge or improve their relationships with their communities, right? So this idea of race treason. And then this anonymous question we got, if there was anything specific that happened that helped define, you know, and drove you into practices and studies of care and care politics. And yeah, I'll pose those two and then we can hopefully answer Alexander's as well as Tegan's. So yeah, stop there.
Thanks, Fatima, for that question. I don't have an answer. I mean, I don't think anyone has an answer to that, but other than, I think the answers you would find within your own kind of experience in evaluating what relationships feel worth your time, right? To do reparative work, transformative work, right? I think for a lot of students of color leaving, and it's kind of related to the anonymous attendee question about what happened in your life, like leaving, I think, different kinds of harmful home life situations, right? Whether it's coming out as queer, trans, or any other set of things, right? Rebuilding and deciding to put in the time to do that repair work sometimes is not reciprocated, right? Or it's very fragile, or different kinds of tension. And so I say that to say, you know, we can't always have improved relationships with everyone from our kind of communities that brought us up or failed to. And so it's kind of deciding what's worth your time. And I think the kind of standard of what that is will change and shift as you center what you need more. And so, yeah, that's kind of like my maybe too abstract of an answer. But yeah, I, you know, growing up in Houston, I immigrated here as a really young person, but I had tons of, I think, kind of pain, harm, violence that happened to me as a young person. And that has really only kind of later in life, I started to make the connections of what drove me to find the communities that I see and feel the most seen in, right? Those weren't immediate things where I was like, therefore I need to find those people, right? It took often, I think, a lot of radical honesty with myself about how these things are interconnected. Therapy helps a lot with that as well. But I definitely just wanted to mention that I think we all end up doing different kinds of radical community care work because of the people we love, right? And I think that's a word that gets misused so much, but it's such an important word, right? In terms of what does love look like in terms of how we show up. So, yeah, pass it to you.
Yeah, I'll try and answer quickly. I mean, I agree with Ren-yo, Fatima. That's a difficult question, but you know, I do affirm folks in remembering that even if you have relationships that you need to repair within communities that, I mean, I don't want to get into an academic conversation about what's community, but you do still belong to that community, right? I mean, not in a sort of like, you can opt into communities that you were never a part of in the first place. Not in that sort of idea that you can just like sign up for a community like an after school club. But if it's a community that you were actively born and raised in, right? And I mean, short of being, I don't want to call anyone out, but short of being a certain type of person, you still are a member of that community. And so I think about the repair work as again, I think I agree, attending to these individual relationships and starting with building blocks and just, you know, going back and just being a part of certain like organizations. I mean, I think that the university degree doesn't give any of us the legitimation to be where we are and to go back with any position of authority. I think it just maybe gives us some other types of tools that we can go back and use, and we don't get to talk about with a certain air of, you know, holier than thou. But yeah, so I guess that's my very short, reticent answer on that. And I think the question about a moment that might have shaped my care practices, I mean, like I said, I've been doing martial arts for like 17, 18 years. So that was something that started very young for me, but my particular sort of routine of care where like I need to like be in movement, you know, no matter how like my chronic pain is feeling, or I need to like be boundaried about my time off and away from like work. I mean, I developed that as an organizer in graduate school, as someone that was doing movement for Black Lives Organizing in Ann Arbor, Michigan around the death of Ora Rosser. And then someone who was doing self-defense organizing. There was a moment where it almost felt like I was not a full-time PhD pre-candidate. I almost like, I say dropped out lightly, but I took like basically a semester not to do graduate school, but to teach self-defense workshops. But like, it was hard to do both the intersections and the other types of Black Lives Matter organizing and self-defense work. And I was like, oh, if I don't have, that was the moment where I was like, oh, I cannot have a breach of my self-care routine. again, because it literally led to my own like anxiety and like exacerbated those things that were already there. So I agree, the boundaries and the therapy definitely help. And I think Ivana had a question in the chat just about the survival pending revolution. And I just wanted to say that that's a saying that is, I mean, you could find across the Black Power movement, but it's from the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And their point was that what are the types of community programs they called survival programs that they could implement pending a literal sort of like social and political upheaval, right? That like if until racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism are all out the window, what are the community programs that we need to survive? So that's what survival pending revolution means.
Thank you, guys. I mean, I think this highlighting too of these like long-standing relationships, whether it's familial or community, as Mari mentioned, also like how that's just so fraught, right? And these are like personal, lifelong things we do all deal with. And I think, yeah, just sort of thinking about the methods and how we deal with them is super rich and helpful. So I'm gonna just pose all three questions. I think two of them are kind of Alexander's as well as Bree's at the end, connected. So I'll pose all three because we only have 5 minutes. I don't want to sort of force really thorough answers, but if you want to sort of just take a moment to address any parts of it, right? So Alex wrote, thank you so much for your time today. So in terms of being able to connect digitally, right, it has changed the way we connect in terms of on a personal level. So how do you project care will continue to evolve as a practice, and in what ways would you suggest that we might be able to aid in care in a broader or individual sense? So maybe thinking about sort of like practices that are sort of easier to do on a more, whether it's digitally or it's sort of beyond that in terms of just contemporary sort of ways that you do that in the daily. And then Tegan posed if you had any thoughts on the duality of being silenced in the way of being told that one is not suffering because they're not visibly marginalized, part of a marginalized group. So again, just about visibility, having the privilege of not being targeted by people due to the visible characteristics, but still suffering the marginalization that comes with being a marginalized group, right? So for example, being white passing, being straight passing, having mental disabilities. And then Bree asked a question, given the quickness of digitization during the pandemic, how, if you do, see networks of care evolving in the coming years? So Alexander's and Bree's connected, and then Tegan's question about sort of invisible sort of forms of targeting. I know these are really big questions and we only have a few more minutes, but yeah, either of you have thoughts.
Yeah, I can try starting. I'll try starting with the digital question. I think it's Alexander and Bree. Thank you both so much. Yeah, that's a tall order question. I mean, I think that if we're thinking about how care might evolve, particularly given digitization and the digital, I mean, I think that one thing we're going to have to keep in mind is, you know, how our care practices that happen digitally can be sort of more surveilled, literally in certain ways, given the digital world. And I think we're going to have to pay attention to really, if we can, I mean, I hope that we continue. And I guess, so the question I say is twofold. Is one, I think that we have to continue to do some forms of virtual care, right? Because I think that as someone that has seen like communities that do not get to see themselves actively in their physical location have actually found ways to thrive and work through some of their mental health because of the digital space, right? And if we immediately go back to saying all events are in person, there's nothing else online, then, or we're not like doing, let's say, all of the like Zoom events or even these panels, right? Like if it was just like, we're just in person at Virginia Tech and it's only everyone that is at Virginia Tech that can have access, I think that like folks are really going to lose out on seeing themselves and being in a broader community that brings a lot of us wellness. But we are going to have to pay attention to the ways in which, right? I mean, Zoom bombing is going to continue to be a thing and it's going to continue to target certain types of events, but also we never know how, I mean, law enforcement has found a way to keep up with every type of technology to surveil folks that are on their lists, right? So I think those are the things that we're going to have to navigate with these networks of care in the digital space. And then I'll come back to the silencing, the dual silencing.
Yeah, I guess I feel like I'm a bit of a broken record in an important way, but a lot of these answers, I feel like each of you all, Bree, Alexander, were answering Tegan's question as well. You have the knowledge within your own kind of embodiment and experience to know how to move forward. As far as the digitization, I think disability justice scholars really did kind of took us to task in terms of thinking about why accessibility through webinars are only a thing that now we're realizing is possible, right? Even in thinking here, like hopefully this will have closed captioning later, right? And so forth. And what are ways in which we can build that? We can take these kind of like hard lessons learned during the pandemic into how we think about collective care, organizing work, mutual aid projects, and a lot of the ways in which Bree used the terms networks of care evolving. I think you all will be the ones to tell us what that looks like, right? Like, what does that look like for you all in terms of being able to ask for support, right? To show up and to build that kind of I would say reciprocal trust with people who can kind of show up for you in moments of crisis. Those are some of the hardest things I think we constantly will be battled with in a capitalist society that kind of valorizes this kind of pull yourself up from the bootstraps kind of US imperial way of thinking about what it means to succeed, right? And so the kind of work I'm thinking about mutual interdependence, like really is a way in which we can combat this idea of self, even the self of self-care, right? Which I hope that is a takeaway from today, right? Is that maybe self-care isn't about the self, right? Maybe self-care is actually about, yes, showing up for our kind of wholeness and our fullness, right? But also in knowing that sometimes that requires other people to be in the room that we trust, and to what does that look like to model and build those relationships, a lot of the work that Mia Mingus is doing. So and I think Maryam was talking about the larger stuff around like what it looks like when we're in this digital sphere, and what are the kind of community safety protocols that we'll do to kind of not have people deter conversations, right? And so yeah, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, I guess to end, so we're not going two at a time.
Yeah.
On the last question, I mean, those categories are all very, very different, right? To be quote unquote straight passing, to be quote unquote white passing, and then those are sort of on a gradient, and are also still very different than having like your like disabilities invisibilized in a race because they're not visible, right? And like Ren-yo said, I mean, disability studies has done a great job of walking us through those paradigms and those issues. But I mean, I would say that it's very real on the on the straight or white passing side of the spectrum to say, actually, I can make space for folks who it's very actually real that folks with different intersections of identities, even if they're shared, receive the harm at disproportionate rates, right? And that's not just specifically about the categories named, right? If you are a Black queer person or a brown queer person, you cannot say the words that trans folks actually receive harm at disproportionate rates, right? Then that's a problem. And it's not that you and your identities are not at risk, right? Like, so I think that there's a way in which you can say, actually, I hold space and I privilege the voices of those that are receiving the impact of this harm, right? On the one hand, but also I belong here. And I think that's something that pedagogues need to do, right? Because as a self-defense instructor, on the one hand, right, if we think about like the xenophobic attacks that like really target folks that are perceived as coming from Latin American countries, for example, right? There are a lot of quote unquote white passing or white Latino folk, right? Who just because you have the ability to acknowledge, I'm not the one that's literally being targeted all the time for a physical hate crime, but literally when someone reads my name on an application, right, there's still amount of hate that I can receive, right? And so I think that there's space to be able to talk about these things in nuanced ways, and history helps us with that specificity. So those are some things I would say.
Well, I'm going to close with, thank you guys for answering these questions in the short amount of time I gave them. And thank you for those who did pose these questions. And I want to just close by saying a really sincere and huge thanks to Ren-yo and Maryam for their time and energy in really helping all of us think about care on the level of sort of the self, as you mentioned, right, in terms of really questioning what that means, but also about community care, about radical care, about sort of care, forms of care that are really revolutionary in the way that they understand sort of the structural antagonisms we live with. So thank you both so much. Thank you, Blake, who's not here, but thank you for the tech. And we appreciate all of you attending, and hopefully we will be able to share this video sooner rather than later without yeah, so that it will also include captioning. But yeah, thank you all. And I will close today's conversation and say thank you to everyone, and Ren-yo and Maryam especially. Bye, guys.
Thank you all. Take care, everyone. Take care of yourselves.
Great. Thank you. Great to meet everyone here.
I'm just going to